It was supposed to be the last perfect night of summer, the kind of night you exaggerate in your head years later, telling people it was all fireworks, laughter, and easy freedom. But when people remember this one, they don't mention the fireworks. They mention the way the dock boards cracked, the way a dare turned into a scream, and how something in the lake screamed back. They remember how the water didn't ripple the way water should, as if the lake itself was waiting for them to lean too close. That's the kind of memory no one tries to dress up in nostalgia. That's the kind you run from, even when you're old enough to know better. The group of friends had planned the send-off for weeks. There were 6 of them, though some swore there were 7 that night, which is strange because nobody could ever agree on the missing name. The official story was simple. Bring snacks, smuggle cheap beer, crank up somebody's cousin's portable speaker, and dare each other into staying past midnight on Lake Merritt's dock. Nothing illegal, nothing too wild, just enough danger to feel like they'd wrung the last drop of freedom out of the summer before college, work, or whatever grown-up life waited. Everyone thought it would be harmless. No one expected the lake to notice. Eli, who always needed to be the loudest voice in any crowd, set the tone by dragging in a cooler that weighed more than him. He cracked open a can before the others had even sat down. His first words were a toast. Here's to our last dumb summer night, before we start pretending to be responsible adults. The group laughed, even though the line hit a little too close to home. Abby rolled her eyes, but drank anyway. She'd been the one to suggest the dock, though later she swore she'd only meant it as a joke. The dock had stories attached to it, stories about people who vanished into the lake when they shouldn't have, about shapes seen under the surface, about voices carrying across the water when the shore was empty. Most dismissed them as campfire tales, but kids like Eli were always eager to test the line between story and reality. The first hour was harmless. Music, snacks, the inevitable argument over who had eaten all the chips. One of them accidentally dropped a soda into the water, and it fizzed quietly before sinking, leaving rings that seemed to spread too far, as if the lake was hungrier than usual. No one mentioned it out loud. That was the first mistake. When the night pressed darker, someone suggested the obvious: a dare. If you didn't dare on the last night of summer, had you even lived? They dared Abby, of course. She was the one with the reputation for ghost stories and clever comebacks. The dare was simple: swim to the buoy and back. It wasn't far, maybe 50 yards out, the chain of a dull orange float bobbing against the moonlight. She rolled her eyes again, but she pulled off her sweatshirt and shoes. "Fine," she said, "but if I get eaten by Nessie, you all owe me gas money in the afterlife." Eli laughed harder than he should have. The others joined in, relieved by her humor, because the truth was none of them wanted to admit the dock had grown strangely quiet. Even the crickets seemed to hush when she stepped into the water. The surface looked glassy, too still for a lake. Abby dove in, breaking it like a mirror, and for a moment everyone cheered. She swam strong, the way someone who had spent summers at the lake always did. But halfway to the buoy, her strokes slowed. She hesitated, treading water, and then she looked back. They couldn't see her expression from the dock, but later some would swear they heard her mutter, "Who's out here?" She turned back toward the buoy. That's when the chain shifted. It was supposed to be anchored, but the buoy jerked unnaturally, yanked down as if something below had grabbed it. Abby screamed, not playful but sharp, desperate. The sound tore across the dock, freezing everyone. Eli leapt up, swearing he'd dive in, but before he could, the water surged. A wave rose where no boat had passed, lifting Abby and slamming her back under. When she resurfaced, she wasn't alone. A hand, gray bloated, too large to belong to her, clung to her arm. She thrashed, kicked, screamed again, and the hand slipped away. In seconds she was back at the dock, clawing up onto the boards, coughing so hard she couldn't speak. No one laughed then. No one suggested it was a prank. They saw the bruise forming where the hand had gripped her, the imprint of fingers that wrapped too far around her arm. Eli dropped to his knees beside her, stammering, "What the hell was that?" Abby finally found her breath. Her voice was hoarse, but she whispered, it asked me why I left." The group fell silent. None of them had the nerve to ask what she meant. The rest of the night blurred. They packed up, silent and shaky, pretending they'd imagined it. But on the walk back, one of them, no one would later agree on who, counted their steps and paused. "Wait," the voice said. "Weren't there 7 of us?" The others snapped at them to shut up, to keep walking. Still, the question clung tighter than Abby's bruise. Because when they looked back at the dock, they could swear someone was still standing there. Someone taller than Eli, broader than anyone in their group, just staring. And then the figure walked straight into the water without a ripple. The summer ended. College started. Everyone moved on, or tried to. They stopped speaking about that night. Abby wore long sleeves, even in September, hiding the mark that never faded. Eli never swam again. And every year when the air turned humid and the fireworks went off by the lake, each of them dreamed the same dream. They were back on the dock, watching someone slip beneath the surface. Sometimes it was Abby. Sometimes it was Eli. Sometimes it was a stranger whose face they couldn't see. But always the lake asked the same question. Why did you leave? The Crawford Diner was the kind of place that had been dying for years, but refused to admit it. The neon sign outside buzzed with only half the letters working, so most nights it read Craw Dier, which locals joked sounded like a swamp monster restaurant. Inside, the floor tiles were cracked, the booths sticky in a way no bleach could cure, and the coffee tasted like someone had wrung out a wet rag over the pot. But the place had one loyal staff member left, Tessa. She was 19, saving up for community college, and stuck on the last shift of August. Nobody wanted that graveyard slot, but Tessa took it because she needed the hours. She figured it would be a quiet night. She figured wrong. The first 2 hours were dead, just her and the fly buzzing around the pie case. She amused herself by stacking ketchup packets into towers and timing how long they'd stay up before collapsing. Around 11, the bell over the door jingled. A man walked in, tall and gaunt, wearing a suit that looked 10 years out of date. His hair was slicked back, but not freshly, more like it had been wet earlier and then dried stiff. He slid into a booth without looking around, like he'd been there 1,000 times. Tessa grabbed her notepad, walked over, and gave the usual line. "Welcome to Crawford's. Coffee or water to start?" The man lifted his eyes to hers and said, very slowly, "It's late for coffee, but I'll take it anyway." His voice had that strange flatness, as if it hadn't been used in weeks. She poured him a cup, and that was when she noticed he didn't blink. Not once. She shook it off, chalking it up to exhaustion. People acted weird at night. But when she walked back behind the counter, the jukebox clicked on. It hadn't worked in months. The owner swore it was fried beyond repair. Yet here it was humming, spitting out static, then sliding into a song. An old crooner ballad about never saying goodbye. Tessa froze, her hand on the coffee pot. The stranger didn't react. He just sipped. The jukebox cut out after 30 seconds, as if embarrassed to be alive again. The silence afterward was heavier than the music. At midnight, another odd thing happened. The clock on the wall, which had been stuck at 8:14 for as long as she could remember, twitched. The hands moved forward, ticking properly, landing on 12 o'clock. She laughed nervously and muttered, "Guess everything comes back from the dead eventually." The stranger put down his cup and said, "Not everything." She almost dropped the pot. It wasn't just the words, it was the way he said them, like he'd been waiting years for someone to set up that exact line. She forced a smile and went back to wiping tables, But her pulse didn't slow down. The kitchen was the next problem. She heard it around 12:30, pans clattering, the fryer sizzling, a drawer slamming shut. She thought maybe another worker had slipped in. Sometimes the cook wandered back after hours to grab leftovers. But when she peeked through the swinging doors, the kitchen was empty. The grill was glowing red-hot. A spatula sat perfectly balanced on the edge of the counter, shaking like someone had just put it down. The freezer door at the back creaked open an inch, then slammed shut hard enough to rattle the shelves. Tessa whispered to herself, "Nope. Nope. Absolutely not." She backed out, her sneakers squeaking on the greasy floor. When she turned, the stranger was no longer in his booth. He was sitting at the counter now, directly across from where she stood, as if he'd been there the whole time. She hadn't heard him move. His cup sat untouched in front of him. He leaned forward. "You shouldn't check the freezer," he said softly. She swallowed, tried to keep her voice steady. "Why not?" He tilted his head. "Because something in there doesn't want to be checked." Then he smiled for the first time, and it wasn't a smile meant for humans. Too wide, too deliberate, like he'd read about smiles in a book and was trying to copy one. She backed away and bumped into the jukebox, which immediately roared to life again, blasting the same song but faster this time, warped like a record being spun too hard. The bell on the door jingled. She turned with a rush of relief. Another customer, thank God. But no one was there. The door swung wide open, letting in the late summer air. When she looked back, the stranger was gone. His cup was still there, full. The stool he had sat on was empty. She stared so hard her eyes watered, convinced he'd pop back into view if she blinked. But nothing. The diner was empty. At least she thought so. She almost clocked out right then, but she needed the hours, and more importantly, she needed to believe she wasn't losing her mind. So she stayed. She busied herself with wiping the counter. The jukebox went silent again. The clock ticked forward like it had never been broken. She let herself breathe. That was when the freezer door opened again. She didn't want to look. Every part of her screamed not to. But she turned, slow and stiff, and saw a figure standing halfway inside the freezer. Not stepping out, not stepping in, just there. It was shaped like a person but darker, as if it absorbed the fluorescent light instead of reflecting it. She could make out the sharp edge of a shoulder, the tilt of a head. And then she realized with horror that it was humming the same song the jukebox had played. Low, guttural, but the same tune. Tessa dropped the rag in her hand. The figure stopped humming. Slowly, it lifted one arm and beckoned. She ran. Out the door. Across the empty parking lot. Not stopping until she was 3 blocks away. She called the diner owner from a payphone near the gas station, babbling about intruders and jukeboxes and the freezer. He told her she was overworked, that she probably imagined half of it. But when he checked the diner the next morning, the freezer door was wide open. Inside, every box of frozen food was untouched, except for one. The pies. Every single pie had been ripped apart, smashed into pieces, as if something had tried to claw its way out of them. And on the freezer wall, scrawled in frost, was a single word, stay. Tessa never worked another night shift again. The Crawford Diner closed 2 months later, boarded up and forgotten. But some nights, when people drive past on the highway, they swear they see the neon flicker to life. Not Crawford's, not Crawd Deer, just one word glowing red in the dark. Stay. Summer camps always look harmless in the daylight. The cabins are small and cheerful, the fire pits ringed with safe stones, the trails marked with friendly arrows. But when the season ends and the last campers go home, the place changes. The laughter gets scraped out of the air. The shadows linger longer. That's what Nate and Marissa found when they snuck back into Camp Evergreen after it closed. They had both worked there as counselors, and they thought it would be fun, maybe nostalgic, to return for one last walk through the grounds. They packed a flashlight, a blanket, and a flask, joking that they'd toast the end of summer under the same stars they had watched with kids only weeks before. They expected quiet. They expected peace. They did not expect the map. They found it pinned to the bulletin board outside the mess hall. The camp director always left behind a simple chart: trails, cabins, lakefront, and bathrooms. But this map had something else. A cabin neither of them had ever seen before, labeled in smudged handwriting as Cabin 7. Evergreen only had 6 cabins, all lined in a neat half-circle by the lake. There was no 7th. Marissa thought it was a prank, maybe a leftover joke from staff orientation. Nate, who had been at Evergreen 3 summers running, frowned. "I know every inch of this place," he said. "That's not real." But then the flashlight flickered, and both of them noticed the faintest arrow drawn in pencil, leading from the campfire ring into the woods. And suddenly, they felt compelled to follow. The forest swallowed them fast. The camp's neat paths were gone, replaced with twisted roots and mossy rocks. Still, the arrow's direction seemed clear, as if the trees leaned just enough to guide them. Marissa made jokes to keep her nerves down, about Blair Witch and hidden tree houses, but her voice was thinner than usual. Nate said nothing. His grip on the flashlight tightened until his knuckles blanched. After 15 minutes, they saw it. A cabin, smaller than the others, crooked as if it had been dropped there by mistake. Its windows were black holes, its roof sagging, but its door was wide open, swinging on rusty hinges. No foundation, no steps. Just planted in the dirt like a tooth that didn't belong in the jaw. Inside, the air was colder, much colder, their breath fogged, even though the August night was sticky outside. The walls were carved, not built. Deep scratches marked the boards in loops and spirals, as if someone had tried to write, but only knew how to claw. In the center sat a single bunk bed, its mattress ripped, its frame leaning. On the top bunk was a backpack, perfectly new. Marissa touched it, and a child's voice whispered, "Don't." She yanked her hand back and nearly fell. Nate's flashlight beam shook across the room. On the wall above the bed was a phrase carved clear among the spirals: "You shouldn't have come back." That was enough for Marissa. She begged Nate to leave, to turn around, to head back to the real cabins. But Nate stood frozen, his eyes locked on the bunk. Slowly he said, "I remember this place." Marissa snapped at him. "No, you don't. This wasn't here." But Nate just kept repeating it. "I remember. I remember." He stepped closer to the bed, reached for the backpack. The zipper slid open by itself. A small shoe fell out, hitting the floor with a soft thud. It was wet, muddy, fresh. The air tightened, like the whole cabin was inhaling. The bunk creaked. Something heavy shifted on it, though nothing was visible. Marissa grabbed Nate's arm, yanking him hard. The flashlight slipped and landed beam up, flooding the cabin ceiling. And that was when they saw it. The ceiling wasn't wood. It was skin, stretched pale, breathing slow as if asleep. Veins pulsed faintly beneath it. The spirals carved into the walls now looked like fingerprints, pressed again and again, circling inward toward the bunk. The ceiling quivered, and from somewhere deep above, a muffled voice groaned, "Stay." Nate snapped out of his trance. Together they bolted, sprinting through the trees with no sense of direction. Branches clawed their arms, roots tore at their ankles, but they didn't stop until the campfire ring appeared in front of them. They collapsed there, gasping, the flask spilling out onto the dirt. Behind them, the forest was silent. No wind, no crickets, nothing. Just a heavy silence that clung like wet clothes. They never spoke of it after that night. The camp reopened the next summer with fresh staff. Cabin counts remained 6. Kids sang songs. Counselors told ghost stories, and nobody mentioned the phantom map. But sometimes at the fire ring, kids whisper they heard humming in the trees, low and guttural, circling them in spirals. A counselor dismissed it as coyotes. Still, when Nate and Marissa drove past years later, long after they quit, they refused to look at the tree line. They both claimed the same thing. If you look too long, you'll see the door swinging, waiting, patient as winter. And here's the closing arc to tie the three tales into a single end of summer punch. About 400 to 500 words. Summer has a way of lying to you. The air feels soft, the nights feel endless, the laughter feels permanent. But when it ends, the truth shows through. That dock on Lake Merritt, that diner on the empty highway, that forgotten cabin in the woods, none of them were about fun or nostalgia. They were places waiting for the right night, the right people, to remind you that endings aren't always gentle. Sometimes they bite. Sometimes they whisper. Sometimes they stay. The kids from the lake grew up, but they never swam again. Tessa left town, but she never shook the sound of a jukebox turning itself on in her dreams. Nate and Marissa had children of their own, but they avoided camping trips, making excuses that always sounded thin. Different people, different towns, different stories, and yet the echoes overlapped. A hand gripping too tight, a word carved in frost, a ceiling that breathed. Always the same message, said in different ways. Stay. By the time the leaves turned, each of them wondered in quiet moments if they had been chosen, or cursed, or simply unlucky. They avoided mirrors, lakes, freezers, woods. They avoided talking about it out loud. But they knew. Some truths are stitched into the air at summer's end, waiting for anyone foolish enough to linger too long, to stretch the night past midnight, to believe the world is done taking from them. Those truths don't fade with the season. They wait, patient as ever, for the next ending. And when the music starts, or the door creaks open, or the water ripples where it shouldn't, the stories won't feel like stories anymore. They'll feel like invitations,